Welcome back to another journey into the past. Tonight we're exploring something that might seem utterly mundane at first glance, yet turns out to be one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval life. We're talking about sleep. Or more specifically, how people in the Middle Ages approached bedtime, what their sleep schedules looked like, and all the strange, surprising, and sometimes alarming rituals that surrounded the simple act of closing one's eyes for the night. Before we drift into this exploration, take a moment to settle in. Maybe adjust your pillow, pull up that blanket, and get comfortable. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into history, consider subscribing to the channel. It really does help. Now, let's ease into the medieval night together. In our modern world, we take for granted a certain rhythm to sleep. You go to bed sometime between 9 in the evening and midnight. You close your eyes, and ideally, you don't open them again until morning. 8 hours uninterrupted is what we're told to aim for. Sleep hygiene experts, doctors, and wellness influencers all preach the gospel of consolidated sleep. One long, continuous block of unconsciousness to recharge our batteries for another day of productivity. But if you could transport yourself back to medieval Europe, say around the year 1200, and observe how ordinary people actually slept, you'd witness something that would seem deeply strange to modern eyes. People didn't sleep in one long stretch, they slept in 2 distinct phases, separated by a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. This practice was so common, so universally understood, that it had its own terminology. The first phase was called, quite simply, first sleep. The second phase, predictably, was second sleep. And that hour or two of wakefulness between them, that was known as the watch. This wasn't some fringe practice observed by monks or nobility with peculiar habits. This was how nearly everyone slept, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest lord. Historical records, including references in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and numerous medical texts from the 15th to 18th centuries, document this biphasic sleep pattern as a natural and widespread habit across pre-industrial societies. The routine was straightforward in its execution. As the sun set and darkness crept across the land, people would prepare for bed relatively early. Without artificial lighting, there simply wasn't much to do once the sun went down. Work in the fields had ceased. Craftsmen had put away their tools. Families gathered around the fire for a simple evening meal, perhaps shared stories or prayers, and then retired to their sleeping spaces. Most people would go to bed around sunset and wake up again around 4 hours later, typically around midnight. This first sleep wasn't light or restless, it was deep restorative rest. The body and mind entered genuine slumber, cycling through the stages of sleep that modern science has documented, complete with dreams and all the biological processes that occur during rest. But then, somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, people would naturally wake up, not with alarm or distress, not feeling that they'd been robbed of sleep or that something was wrong. They simply woke up as naturally as you might stir in the morning when sunlight streams through your window. And what did they do during this wakeful interlude? The activities varied widely depending on one's circumstances, social class, and personal inclinations. Some people used this time to pray or read religious texts, tend fires, check on livestock, or engage in intimacy with their partners. Medieval physicians and marriage manuals actually recommended this middle-of-the-night period as an ideal time for marital relations. The logic was simple and, in its own way, rather sweet. The body was well rested from the first sleep, the mind was calm and free from the worries and stresses of the day, and there was a peaceful quiet to the household that made intimacy feel natural rather than rushed. In rural areas, farmers would sometimes take this opportunity to check on their animals. Livestock represented significant wealth, and in an era when survival depended on them, a quick midnight check could bring peace of mind. Was the goat still in the pen? Were the chickens safe from foxes? These weren't idle concerns, but real threats to a family's livelihood. Some people simply lay in bed and thought. They reflected on the day that had passed, contemplated the day to come, or let their minds wander through memories and imaginings. This was also a favoured time for prayer and meditation. Christians would use this quiet hour for prayer and spiritual reflection when the world was still and nobody was up working. It was considered a peaceful, sacred time when one could commune with God without distraction. Scholars and the literate class sometimes used the watch for reading or writing. By candlelight or the glow of a well-maintained fire, they could work on correspondence, copy manuscripts, or simply read for pleasure. Historical records suggest that some even visited neighbours during these hours. In certain communities, social calls during the watch weren't uncommon. You might walk next door to your neighbour's house, find them awake as you were, and chat for an hour before both of you return to your respective beds for the second sleep. After an hour or two of this wakeful activity, people would return to bed. The second sleep would carry them through until dawn or shortly thereafter, depending on the season. Both phases of sleep lasted roughly the same amount of time, meaning if first sleep was 4 hours, second sleep would also be around 4 hours. The total amount of sleep remained similar to what we aim for today, just broken into tier 2 segments rather than one continuous block. Modern scientific experiments have actually explored whether this pattern might be natural for humans. In the 1990s, researcher Thomas Ware at the National Institute of Mental Health conducted a study that recreated pre-industrial lighting conditions. When subjects were exposed to darkness for 14 hours each day, so simulating a world without electricity, their sleep patterns shifted within weeks. They began sleeping for about 4 hours, waking naturally for 1 to 3 hours, then returning to sleep for another 4 hours. The pattern closely resembled what Ekirch had found in historical records. What's particularly interesting is that during the wakeful period in Ware's experiment, subjects experienced an unusual hormonal state. Prolactin levels, the hormone associated with relaxation and the dreamlike state between sleep and waking, remained elevated throughout the night. The subjects reported feeling unusually calm and peaceful during these midnight hours, a state rare compared to meditation, free from the anxiety that often accompanies modern middle-of-the-night wakefulness. So when did this practice disappear? The decline of segmented sleep appears to have been gradual, traced primarily to the development of artificial lighting. Gas street lamps in the early 19th century, followed by the invention of the incandescent light bulb, fundamentally changed nighttime. As homes and streets became illuminated, bedtimes were pushed later and later. The Industrial Revolution also fundamentally changed attitudes toward work and time. Productivity and efficiency became paramount values. The idea of waking up in the middle of the night to pray, chat with neighbours, or simply reflect seemed wasteful, an inefficient use of hours that could be devoted to work or consolidated rest. By the 20th century, the practice of segmented sleep had almost entirely vanished from collective memory in industrialised nations. Most people had no idea that their ancestors slept differently. It wasn't until historian Roger Ekirch began his research into nighttime history in the 1990s and published his findings in 2001 that the pattern was rediscovered and brought to wider attention. Ekirch found references to first sleep and second sleep scattered throughout historical documents, from ancient Greece and Rome through the early modern period, in locations across Europe and beyond. The medieval world's approach to sleep reminds us that what feels natural isn't always what's actually natural for human biology. Our current obsession with 8 uninterrupted hours is itself a relatively recent invention, shaped more by industrial capitalism and artificial lighting than by any intrinsic human need. Medieval people didn't view their nighttime waking as insomnia or a problem to be solved. It was simply how sleep worked, a rhythm as natural as breathing. Now that we've established how medieval people slept, let's talk about where they slept and what that experience was actually like. In our modern world, we obsess over mattresses, memory foam, pocket springs, cooling gel, adjustable bases, thread counts, firmness levels. We invest thousands in creating the perfect sleep environment. Walk into any furniture store and you'll find an entire section dedicated to the science and luxury of sleep surfaces. Medieval Europe had a somewhat different approach. For the vast majority of people, a bed wasn't a luxury item to be carefully selected after testing dozens of options. It was whatever you could cobble together to keep yourself off the cold, damp ground. Let's start at the bottom of the social ladder and work our way up. If you were a peasant, which most people were, your sleeping arrangement was basic in the extreme. The poorest people slept on a straw mattress on the floor with whatever warm covering they could get. Now, when we say straw mattress, we're not talking about a proper mattress in the modern sense. We're talking about a rough sack, if you were lucky enough to have a sack stuffed with straw or hay. The simplest bed was just a pile of straw, not very comfortable because it was prickly, but one could throw a sheet or blanket over it. If you didn't even have a sack, you'd simply lay the straw directly on the floor, spread a blanket or cloak over it, and call that your bed. The straw served multiple purposes. It provided some cushioning between your body and the hard ground. More importantly, it offered insulation against the cold that seeped up from the earth, especially in winter. But straw had its drawbacks. Oh, did it have drawbacks? First, it was prickly. Those sharp little pieces of dried grass had a way of poking through whatever fabric you laid over them, finding their way to your skin and making rest less restful. Second, straw required regular changing. Henry VIII had a straw mattress that was changed every day. However, most mattresses were only changed once a year. For peasants who couldn't afford daily or even monthly changes, this meant sleeping on increasingly decomposed, musty, and pest-ridden straw. And that brings us to the third major drawback: the wildlife. Straw was essentially a 5-star hotel for insects. Fleas loved it, lice adored it. Bedbugs considered it paradise. Mice found it cozy. Lice, fleas and bedbugs made themselves at home in bed, that is, and most people just accepted it as a part of life. If you felt something crawling on you in the middle of the night, you didn't panic. You didn't leap out of bed in horror. You just shifted slightly, maybe scratched a bit and tried to get back to sleep. The idea of a bite-free, pest-free sleeping environment simply didn't exist for most people. It was accepted with the same resignation that medieval people accepted many other hardships of life. You couldn't control it, you couldn't afford the remedies that might help, so you endured it. Some families tried to combat the pest problem with tightly woven mattress covers called ticking, or by storing their bedding in cedar's chests when not in use. Others tucked herbs like wormwood or ladies' bed straw into their straw mattresses, as these plants were believed to repel fleas. If your family had a bit more money, perhaps you were a successful craftsman or a merchant, you might elevate your straw mattress off the ground. A bed frame consisted of ropes strung back and forth for the springs, with a linen bag stuffed with straw, grass, bed straw, wool or feathers laid on top. This simple elevation made a surprising difference. It reduced the cold that crept up from the floor. It gave you a bit more dignity, a sense that you were sleeping like a proper person rather than an animal in a barn. And it reduced, though didn't eliminate, the number of beetles and other ground-dwelling creatures that might crawl into your sleeping space. The rope springs required regular maintenance. They would sag in the middle over time, creating an uncomfortable dip where your body naturally settled. Hence the old expression sleep tight, which originally referred to tightening those ropes to maintain a firm, even sleeping surface. If you neglected this maintenance, you'd end up sleeping in an increasingly uncomfortable hammock-like dip. Even with a proper bed frame, most peasants still slept on straw or hay-stuffed mattresses. But those who could afford it upgraded to wool. Wool-filled mattresses were valuable enough to be mentioned in middle-class wills. Wool had significant advantages over straw. It was softer, warmer, and while it still attracted pests, it was less hospitable to them than straw. It also held up better over time, maintaining its structure and cushioning properties where straw would flatten and decompose. Now let's climb a bit higher on the social ladder. The richest houses had large, elaborate beds with ornamented canopies, richly embroidered hangings, and soft feather beds under fine linen sheets. For the wealthy, a bed was more than a place to sleep. It was a status symbol, often the single most expensive piece of furniture in the entire house. These elaborate beds were among the most splendid pieces of furniture in a large house, and noblemen often had their emblems embroidered on the hangings. They were so valuable that they appeared prominently in wills passed down through generations like family heirlooms. You might not inherit much land or money, but by God you'd inherit grandfather's magnificent 4-poster bed with its silk curtains and feather mattresses. The construction of a noble bed was a layered affair. At the bottom, you'd typically have a base mattress filled with straw or horsehair. The best beds had a canvas mattress, or two filled with wool or straw, and then the feather bed. This under mattress provided structure and support. On top of that came the prized possession, the feather bed. This was a thick layer of goose or duck down encased in fine fabric. It wasn't firm enough to sleep on directly, which is why it went on top of the sturdier under mattress, but it provided a plush, comfortable top layer that cradled the body. Next came a bolster, a long cylindrical pillow that ran the width of the bed at the head. A bolster was laid at the head end and covered with a head sheet, with additional pillows propped on the bolster for each sleeper. Sometimes a head sheet would be draped over these pillows at bedtime to protect them from oils and sweat from the sleeper's hair. Then came the linens. Sheets were a luxury item. The best sheets were made of wren linen, while cheaper sheets were made of hemp or coarse linen. Most peasants didn't have sheets at all. They slept directly on their straw or wool mattresses, perhaps with a blanket between them and the mattress material. But the wealthy enjoyed pairs of sheets, and that plural is important. Having both a bottom sheet and a top sheet was a mark of affluence. Blankets came next, providing warmth. And finally a coverlet, which was essentially a bedspread. The most luxurious coverlets could be lined with fur, or be reversible with 2 different expensive kinds of silk used in the making. These weren't just functional items, they were works of art meant to be displayed and admired. But perhaps the most distinctive feature of a noble bed was its canopy and curtains. These served multiple practical purposes. First, they provided warmth. In drafty medieval buildings with poor insulation and large stone walls that radiated cold, those heavy fabric curtains created a smaller enclosed space that could be warmed by body heat. When you drew the curtains closed around your bed, you were essentially creating a room within a room, a private cocoon that trapped warmth and kept out drafts. Second, the curtains provided privacy. In an era when most households slept multiple people to a room, and servants might be sleeping on the floor nearby, having curtains around your bed gave you a small zone of seclusion. You could undress, conduct intimate activities, or simply sleep without feeling constantly observed. Third, and perhaps less romantically, the curtains helped keep out insects. They weren't perfect at this job, but they provided at least some barrier against the mosquitoes, flies, and other airborne pests that made nighttime miserable in warm weather. Beds were social places for the wealthy, with some nobles receiving guests and even conducting meetings from them. It wasn't considered strange for a lord to receive visitors while reclining in bed, propped up on pillows, conducting business or socialising. The bed served as a stage for displaying wealth and status, and among the upper classes, could function as a legitimate space for public interaction. For most medieval people, though, a bed wasn't a place of comfort in any sense we'd recognise. It was simply a spot that was marginally better than sleeping on bare ground. It was often damp, always crawling with pests, and shared with multiple family members. Privacy was non-existent, comfort was relative, and yet, after a day of back-breaking labour, even a scratchy straw pallet must have felt like a gift. When we hear the term nightcap today, most of us think of a drink, perhaps a finger of whiskey or a glass of warm milk consumed before bed to help ease the transition to sleep. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a beverage at all. It was exactly what it sounds like, a cap that you wore at night while sleeping. Now, to modern sensibilities, the idea of wearing a hat to bed seems almost comical. We picture cartoon characters or Christmas illustrations of Ebenezer Scrooge and his pointed sleeping cap, and it feels like pure fiction or exaggeration. But nightcaps were absolutely real, and they served a vital practical purpose in the medieval world. Nightcaps were the cloth caps, worn with other nightwear, historically used in cold climates of northern Europe from the Middle Ages to the 20th century. Medieval homes were cold, brutally cold in winter. Stone walls, thatched roofs, windows made of oiled parchment or thin animal horn, dirt or stone floors. Central heating wouldn't exist for centuries. The only source of warmth was the fire in the hearth, and that fire had to be carefully maintained through the night or it would go out, leaving the household freezing by morning. Human bodies lose heat rapidly through the head. It's one of the first places where you feel cold and one of the last to warm up. People thought cold air was harmful and unwholesome to health, so a nightcap protected them, especially if they had a receding hairline or sensitive head. So medieval people, practical as ever, covered their heads before going to sleep. Men's nightcaps were traditionally pointed hats with a long top, sometimes with a pom-pom on the end, and the long end could be used like a scarf to keep the back of the neck warm. If you've ever seen an illustration of a medieval person sleeping, chances are they're wearing one of these distinctive pointed caps. They weren't making a fashion statement, they were trying not to freeze to death. Women wore nightcaps too, though theirs were often different in style. Women's nightcaps were usually a long piece of cloth wrapped around the head, or a triangular cloth tied under the chin. For married women, there was an additional consideration beyond warmth. In many medieval communities, married women were expected to keep their heads covered at all times, even during sleep. This was partly about modesty and partly about social propriety. Loose, uncovered hair was associated with maidens and unmarried women. A married woman kept her hair bound and covered. The nightcap also served a social function. In more urban settings, if you opened your door wearing a nightcap, it was a polite way of saying you weren't dressed for conversation. It was the medieval equivalent of answering the door in your pyjamas with a clear message: "I'm not prepared to receive guests. Whatever you need can wait until morning." But what about the rest of one's nighttime attire? Did medieval people wear pyjamas? Did they have special clothes for sleeping? The answer is complicated and changed over the course of the medieval period. In the earlier Middle Ages, clothes specifically designated for nighttime were not really a thing, with night clothes and pyjamas being a later medieval phenomenon. For much of the medieval period, people either slept in their day clothes or slept naked. According to medieval chronicles, particularly from the 14th century, no clothes at all were worn at night in some regions, with people sleeping naked, though coifs might have been worn. This was especially true among the wealthy who had proper beds, plenty of blankets, and well-heated homes. Why bother with special sleeping clothes when you're already warm and comfortable under layers of wool and fur? But this presented challenges for others. People of lower standing might have slept with their clothes on for the simple goal of remaining warmer. If you're sleeping on straw in a drafty cottage with minimal blankets, keeping your day clothes on makes perfect sense. The fabric, even if it's just a rough woolen tunic, provides an extra layer of insulation. The practice of sleeping in day clothes was also common in monasteries during the early medieval period. According to the rule of St. Benedict from the early 6th century, monks were required to sleep clothed, wearing their tunic and cowl to bed. This had multiple purposes. First, it made it faster to get to the chapel for nighttime prayers. When the bell rang for matins at 2 a.m, a monk could simply get up and go without having to dress first. Second, it enforced discipline and asceticism. Comfort, even the minor comfort of taking off your scratchy woolen robe before sleep, was seen as a potential source of spiritual weakness. As the medieval period progressed, attitudes towards sleepwear evolved. By the late Middle Ages, nightshirts and nightgowns were common. These were loose, simple garments, essentially long tunics or shifts made of linen or hemp. They weren't designed for style or seduction, they were practical, allowing freedom of movement and providing a layer of warmth without the constraints of day clothing. The nightshirt evolved from underwear, as the shirt in medieval times was an undergarment, with the long shirt serving as the basic layer worn under outer clothing. For men, a nightshirt might be similar to the long linen shirt they wore under their tunics during the day, just perhaps a bit longer and looser. For women, a nightgown or nightshift served the same purpose. What you wore to bed, like almost everything in medieval life, depended heavily on your social status and wealth. What was worn depended on one's means, personal preferences, time of year, sleeping conditions, and who else was sharing the bed. A peasant in winter might sleep fully clothed, wrapped in whatever cloak or blanket they owned. A noble in summer might sleep naked or in a light linen shift. A monk would sleep in his habit, uncomfortable and scratchy as it might be. Nearly everyone wore a cap or kerchief to bed to keep their heads warm, with women braiding their hair and tying it up to keep it from tangling. This practical hairstyle served double duty. It kept long hair from getting snarled during the night's tossing and turning, and it helped keep the head warm when combined with a cap or cloth covering. By the 15th century, dedicated nightwear was becoming more common, at least among those who could afford it. A monastic nightcoat was a circular garment that was probably thigh-length, representing a distinct piece of clothing specifically for sleeping. This evolution represented a shift in thinking. Sleep was beginning to be seen as its own activity, distinct from waking life and therefore deserving of its own specialised garments. But for most of the medieval period and for most people, the concept of special pyjamas or sleepwear was foreign. You slept in whatever kept you warm, preserved your modesty if you were sharing a bed with others, and was practical given your circumstances. Fashion wasn't a consideration. Comfort was negotiable. Survival and warmth were all that mattered. For medieval people, going to bed wasn't simply a matter of lying down and closing your eyes. It was a spiritually significant moment, one that required careful preparation and ritual. The reason was simple and terrifying. You might not wake up. Death in sleep was a real and constant possibility in a world filled with disease, poor nutrition, limited medical knowledge, and all manner of dangers. Going to sleep meant temporarily surrendering consciousness, making yourself vulnerable, and taking a genuine risk that you might cross over from natural sleep to eternal rest without warning. This wasn't paranoia or excessive morbidity. It was realism. Medieval people understood that death could come at any moment, so evening prayers were crucial for ensuring the soul was prepared. Infant mortality was staggering. Childhood diseases killed with brutal frequency. Adults died of infections from minor wounds. Plague and other epidemic diseases could sweep through a community and kill dozens in days. Going to bed with unconfessed sins, with your spiritual house in disorder, was a risk few were willing to take. So bedtime prayers weren't optional. They weren't just comforting rituals or gentle traditions. They were essential spiritual insurance, and they were taken very seriously by everyone from the wealthiest noble to the poorest peasant. Medieval evening prayers often asked for protection from demons, bad dreams, and death during the night. These prayers acknowledged the very real fears that people carried with them into sleep. The darkness was considered a time when evil forces were most active, when the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds was thinnest, when demons and malevolent spirits might have easier access to vulnerable human souls. One common prayer, familiar even today in modified form, speaks to these anxieties. The verse, "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," comes from a prayer that, while its exact medieval origins are debated, reflects the mindset of the era. The sentiment acknowledging death as a possible outcome of sleep was widespread in medieval bedtime prayers. To modern ears, especially when recited by children, this sounds morbid. But in its original context, it was simply honest. Death before morning was a genuine possibility, and ensuring that your soul was commended to God's care before you lost consciousness was prudent spiritual practice. Medieval prayer books and manuscripts contain numerous evening prayers designed to be recited before sleep. One ancient prayer, te lucis ante terminum, which translates roughly to "before the ending of the day," was sung at Compline in the Roman Rite. This hymn, likely dating to the 7th or 8th century, captures the medieval mindset perfectly. It acknowledges that sleep brings vulnerability, that the night holds dangers both physical and spiritual, and it asks God to stand watch while the supplicant rests. The prayer asks specifically for protection from somnia et noctium phantasmata, dreams and nighttime phantoms. These weren't just bad dreams in the modern sense of unpleasant mental experiences. Medieval people believed that some dreams were sent by demons to corrupt, tempt, or terrify the sleeper. Protecting yourself from evil dreams was considered as important as protecting yourself from physical harm. Historical bedtime prayers for children, documented in later medieval and early modern periods, ask God to forgive wrongdoings from the day and provide protection through the night. These prayers served multiple purposes. They taught children basic theology and the habit of prayer. They provided comfort in the face of darkness and fear, and they ensured that even young souls were spiritually prepared should death come during sleep. Medieval prayers before sleep were in first-person singular for private devotion, asking for protection, forgiveness of sins, and peaceful rest. The intimacy of these prayers is striking. This wasn't communal worship with others present. This was a person, alone, or nearly alone in the vulnerability of impending sleep, having a direct conversation with God. The prayers asked for specific things: forgiveness for the sins of the day, protection for loved ones, safety from spiritual enemies, and the grace to wake again in the morning. Some prayers also expressed the hope that the heart would remain watchful, even while the body slept. Drawing on imagery from the Song of Songs in the Bible, these prayers suggested that the soul could maintain a kind of spiritual vigilance even during physical rest, continuing to commune with God throughout the night. This concept offered comfort, the idea that even in sleep's vulnerability, one's spiritual connection to God remained active. For monks and nuns, evening prayers were especially elaborate. The prayer service of Compline was the final office before bed, after which monks took a vow of silence. Compline, typically held around 9 in the evening, was specifically designed as a preparation for sleep. It included prayers for protection, readings from Georgia scripture, and hymns like Te lucis ante terminum. After Compline concluded, the monks would proceed in silence to their dormitories. No speaking was permitted. The transition from prayer to sleep was meant to be solemn and contemplative, allowing the mind to remain focused on spiritual matters rather than worldly concerns. Some particularly devout individuals kept prayer books by their bedside and would recite additional prayers even after Compline, asking specific saints for intercession. St. Michael was popular for protection against demons, St. Christopher for safe passage through the night, the Virgin Mary for mercy and compassion. These weren't abstract theological exercises. People genuinely believed that calling upon these holy figures could create a protective barrier around them while they slept. The wealthy might have a priest or chaplain lead household prayers before bed, though this was more common in castles and manor houses than in typical homes. For most people, bedtime prayers were private or family affairs, with parents leading children through familiar recitations, teaching them the words and rhythms that would protect their souls. Beyond formal prayers, many people made the sign of the cross over themselves, their beds, and sometimes their doors before sleeping. This simple gesture was believed to sanctify the space and ward off evil. Some placed blessed objects near their beds, like a rosary, a small crucifix, or a relic of a saint. These physical reminders of faith served as spiritual protection throughout the vulnerable hours of sleep. The medieval understanding of bedtime prayers reveals how deeply religion permeated every aspect of daily life. Sleep wasn't a secular activity, it was a spiritual passage, a nightly journey through darkness that required divine guidance and protection. The prayers weren't just about comfort or tradition, they were about survival, both physical and spiritual, in a world where the line between waking and eternal rest was frighteningly thin. In modern times, letting your dog or cat sleep in your bed is a personal choice, sometimes a controversial one that sparks debates about hygiene and boundaries. But in medieval Europe, sharing your sleeping space with animals wasn't a choice born of affection or companionship. It was a practical necessity driven by the primal need to stay warm through the bitter cold of winter nights. Let's be clear about the living conditions we're discussing. Medieval homes, especially those of peasants and common folk, were not the cosy separated rooms we imagine today. The typical peasant dwelling was a single-room structure where all of life's activities took place. Cooking, eating, working and sleeping all happened in the same space. And often that space was shared with the family's livestock. In many peasant homes, particularly in northern Europe where winters were harsh, animals lived inside the house during the cold months. This wasn't about being farm to table or rustic charm, it was about mutual survival. The animals needed shelter from freezing temperatures, and the humans needed the heat that those animals generated simply by existing. A cow or ox radiates significant body heat. Large animals can noticeably raise the temperature of an enclosed space, perhaps by several degrees. In a drafty cottage with no insulation and minimal heating beyond a central hearth, those few degrees could mean the difference between tolerably cold and dangerously cold. So the family cow or goat might spend the night just a few feet away from where the family slept, sometimes separated by nothing more than a low barrier or partition. Smaller animals were even more intimately involved in sleeping arrangements. Dogs were valued not just for their ability to guard and herd, but for the warmth they provided. A large dog curled up at the foot of your straw pallet could keep your feet from going numb through the night. Historical accounts note that people commonly slept with dogs for warmth, with the animals serving as living heating pads. The practice of sleeping with dogs for warmth has left traces in language. The phrase three-dog night, referring to an extremely cold night when you'd need 3 dogs sleeping with you to stay warm, has origins debated by scholars. Some attribute it to Australian Aboriginal peoples who slept with dingoes, others to Arctic indigenous peoples like the Chukchi of Siberia who used their sled dogs for warmth. Regardless of its exact origin, the concept reflects a practice that was common across cold climates worldwide, where dogs served as living heat sources during the coldest nights. Chickens were another common bedroom companion, though less by design and more because they simply wandered wherever they pleased. In peasant homes without separate rooms or secure chicken coops, the birds might roost on rafters, in corners, or wherever they felt safe. Waking up to find a chicken perched near your head wasn't unusual. It was just another morning in medieval life. Cats, while valued for keeping rodent populations under control, also found their way into sleeping arrangements. A cat curled up on your chest or pressed against your back provided warmth. And unlike dogs, cats were small enough and agile enough to navigate crowded sleeping spaces without causing too much disruption. But the practice of sleeping near animals had its downsides, and they were considerable. First, there was the noise. Animals don't observe human sleep schedules. A cow might low in the middle of the night. Chickens could start their pre-dawn crowing while it was still pitch dark. Dogs would bark at real or imagined threats. Anyone who has ever tried to sleep near farm animals knows that silence is not their strong suit. Second, there was the smell. Medieval homes weren't known for their fresh air to begin with, and adding the scent of livestock, wet dog, chicken droppings, and animal bedding created an aromatic environment that we would find absolutely unbearable. But medieval people, with their different standards of hygiene and different olfactory tolerance, simply accepted it as normal. Third, and perhaps most problematically, there were the fleas. Animals, especially dogs and livestock, were absolutely riddled with fleas. These fleas had no loyalty to their host species and would happily jump from a dog to a human, or from straw bedding to sleeping person. Sleeping in close proximity to animals meant accepting that you would be bitten repeatedly throughout the night. It wasn't pleasant, but it was the price of staying warm. For wealthier families, the situation was somewhat different. Nobles and merchants didn't typically share their bedrooms with cows and chickens, but they still often slept with dogs. Small lapdogs were especially popular among the wealthy, serving as both companions and bed warmers. These dogs weren't working animals, they were pampered pets, often better fed than many humans, and they enjoyed the privilege of sleeping on expensive feather beds with their owners. Some castles and manor houses had separate sleeping quarters for favourite dogs, small alcoves or cushioned areas where the dogs could rest near their owners, but not actually in the bed. This represented a middle ground between the peasant practice of piling in with livestock for warmth and the modern notion of keeping animals out of sleeping spaces entirely. Historical records occasionally mention the practice of using bed warmers, metal pans filled with hot coals that were run between the sheets before bedtime to warm them. But these were luxury items. For most people, a warm dog or the residual heat from a nearby cow was the best bed warmer available. Children often slept curled up with the family dog for both warmth and a sense of security. In a world where darkness was absolute and filled with real dangers, from thieves to wild animals to unexplained noises, having a dog that would bark at any disturbance was comforting. The dog was a guardian as much as a heating source. The practice of sleeping near or with animals persisted in rural areas well into the early modern period, only truly dying out as housing improved. Heating became more sophisticated, and living spaces were increasingly separated into distinct rooms for distinct purposes. But for the vast majority of the medieval period, sharing your sleeping space with creatures great and small was simply how life worked. Warmth, survival, and the realities of medieval housing left little room for the squeamishness we might feel today. In our modern world, dreams are often dismissed as random neural firing, the brain's way of processing information and consolidating memories while the body rests. We might find a particularly vivid dream interesting or a recurring nightmare troubling, but we rarely assign them deep spiritual significance. We understand them as products of our own minds, not messages from external forces. Medieval people saw dreams very differently. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were communications, warnings, prophecies, or temptations. They could come from God, from saints, from angels, or from demons. They could reveal hidden truths, predict the future, or expose secret sins. And because dreams had such potential power and significance, medieval people took them very, very seriously. The theological and philosophical framework for understanding dreams in the medieval period drew heavily from classical sources, particularly Macrobius's commentary on the Dream of Scipio, which categorized different types of dreams and their meanings. Medieval scholars built on this foundation, creating elaborate systems for interpreting dreams within a Christian context. Dreams could be divine revelations. The Bible is full of significant dreams, from Jacob's ladder to Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams, to Joseph being warned in a dream to flee to Egypt with Mary and the infant Jesus. Medieval Christians understood that God could and did communicate through dreams, delivering messages, guidance, or warnings to chosen individuals. Saints and mystics frequently reported visionary dreams. Hildegard of Bingen, Mechthild of Magdeburg, and countless other medieval holy people experienced what they described as divine visions during sleep or in dreamlike states. These dreams were recorded, analysed, and sometimes even used to make important decisions or shape church policy. A dream from a trusted holy person could carry significant weight. But dreams could also be demonic in origin. Medieval theologians believed that demons could plant dreams in people's minds to tempt them, frighten them, or lead them into sin. A dream featuring lust, violence, or other sinful content might be a demonic assault on the soul. Even if you didn't act on the dream, the fact that you had experienced it could be spiritually troubling. Did the dream reveal hidden sinful desires? Was your soul being tested? Should you confess the dream to a priest? This created a complicated moral landscape around dreaming. On one hand, you couldn't control your dreams. They happened while you were unconscious, without your will or permission. On the other hand, medieval theology suggested that dreams could reveal the true state of your soul. A person who dreamed frequently of sinful acts might have a spiritually polluted soul, even if they behaved virtuously while awake. Some dreams were considered prophetic or precognitive. People who dreamed of future events, especially if those dreams came true, were regarded with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Was their gift from God or from darker sources? The Church was cautious about claims of prophetic dreams, knowing that such claims could be used to manipulate people or challenge church authority. Medieval dream interpretation manuals, influenced by both Christian theology and older folk traditions, provided guidance for understanding common dream symbols. Dreaming of water might signify purification or baptism, or it might represent danger and drowning. Fire could represent divine love or hellfire. Animals had specific meanings. Dreaming of a lion might represent Christ or the devil, depending on the context and other dream elements. Monks and nuns were expected to report significant dreams to their superiors. In monastic settings, dreams were taken as potential messages from God regarding the spiritual life of the community or specific individuals. A monk who dreamed repeatedly of darkness or being lost might be seen as struggling spiritually and in need of additional guidance or penance. Nightmares had their own special category and their own particular terror. The word nightmare itself comes from night and mare, with mare referring to a female evil spirit or demon that was believed to sit on a sleeper's chest, causing feelings of suffocation and fear. This phenomenon, now understood as sleep paralysis, was terrifying and common enough in medieval experience to generate numerous folk beliefs and protective practices. Sleep paralysis occurs when a person becomes conscious before their body has fully emerged from the paralyzed state of REM sleep. You're awake enough to be aware of your surroundings, but your body won't respond to commands to move. This often comes with hallucinations, typically a sense of presence in the room or a feeling of something pressing on your chest, making it difficult to breathe. For medieval people with no scientific understanding of sleep states and brain function, this was clearly supernatural attack. The incubus and succubus legends, demons that sexually assaulted sleepers, likely also originated from sleep paralysis experiences combined with nocturnal emissions or sexual dreams. These weren't seen as natural physiological occurrences, but as genuine demonic encounters. The Church took such reports seriously, and numerous theological treatises discussed how to protect oneself from such attacks. Protection from nightmares and demon-sent dreams involved the usual spiritual defences. Prayer before sleep, as we've discussed, was the first line of defence. Blessed objects placed near or in the bed could help. Some people made the sign of the cross on their pillow or mattress before lying down. Others recited specific prayers known to be effective against nightmares, asking for angelic protection throughout the night. Certain herbs were believed to prevent bad dreams. Placing sprigs of wormwood, vervain, or mugwort under your pillow or in your mattress was a common folk practice, one that blended pre-Christian herbal magic with Christian prayer. The Church officially disapproved of such practices, considering them potentially superstitious or pagan, but many people did them anyway, perhaps reasoning that any protection was worth trying. Some medieval people kept dream journals, recording significant dreams and trying to discern their meanings. This practice was especially common among the educated and the religious, who saw dreams as worthy of serious analysis. Looking back over recorded dreams might reveal patterns or repeated symbols that could provide spiritual insight. The interpretation of dreams wasn't just a personal matter. Professional dream interpreters existed, though they occupied an uncertain space in medieval society. Were they wise seers helping people understand divine messages, or were they charlatans and possible heretics claiming knowledge they couldn't possess? The Church was deeply suspicious of anyone claiming special interpretive powers, especially if those claims seemed to bypass church authority. Literary works from the medieval period frequently featured significant dreams. The Dream of the Rood, Pearl, Piers Plowman, and countless other texts used dream narratives as framing devices or central plot elements. These literary dreams often blended genuine medieval dream experiences with allegorical and didactic content, creating texts that operated on multiple levels. For medieval people, the boundary between dreaming and waking life was more permeable than it is for us. Dreams weren't just random mental experiences to be forgotten. They were encounters with other realities, messages from other realms, windows into spiritual truths. Going to sleep meant opening yourself to those other realities, for better or worse, and that made every night an adventure, or possibly an ordeal, depending on what visited you in the darkness. If you think your sleep schedule is difficult, consider the medieval monk. These men and women in convents lived according to a schedule so rigid, so demanding, so completely unconcerned with natural human sleep patterns that it would break most modern people within a week. The monastic day was structured around the canonical hours, also called the divine office or liturgy of the hours. These were specific times throughout the day and night when monks gathered to pray, sing psalms, and worship collectively. The exact timing varied between different monastic orders and over time, but the basic structure remained consistent throughout the medieval period. The canonical hours typically included matins in the middle of the night, lauds at dawn, prime at sunrise, terce at mid-morning, sext at midday, none in mid-afternoon, vespers in the evening, and complina before bed. That's 8 separate prayer services scattered throughout a 24-hour period. Some of these services were relatively brief, perhaps 20 minutes. Others, particularly matins, could stretch to an hour or more. The most challenging of these hours was undoubtedly matins, also called vigils or nocturnes. This service took place in the middle of the night, typically around 2 or 3 in the morning. Imagine this: you've gone to bed after compline around 9 in the evening. You're in the midst of your first sleep. The dormitory is cold, dark, and silent. And then a bell begins to toll, shattering that peaceful silence and pulling you from deep slumber. There was no snooze button. There was no negotiation. The bell rang, and you got up. Medieval monks slept fully clothed in their habits specifically to make this middle-of-the-night rising faster and easier. You didn't need to dress. You simply swung your legs out of bed, put on your shoes if you'd removed them, and shuffled through the dark dormitory to the church or chapel. The journey from dormitory to church was made in complete silence. After compline, the great silence had begun, and it wouldn't be broken until after morning prayers. So dozens of monks would file through dark corridors or across cold courtyards, not speaking, barely making a sound beyond the shuffle of feet and the rustle of robes. The church itself would be dimly lit, perhaps by a few candles or rushlights, certainly not brightly illuminated. The monks would take their places in the choir stalls and begin the service of matins. This involved chanting psalms, reading from scripture, singing hymns, and often reflecting on lengthy portions of the Bible or writings of church fathers. Depending on the order and the season, matins could last anywhere from 1 hour to 2 hours or even longer. You stood through most of it, though some orders allowed sitting during certain portions. But there was no lying down, no resting your eyes, no checking out mentally. You were expected to participate fully, to sing when singing was called for, to respond at the appropriate moments, to be fully present for this worship in the darkest part of the night. And this happened every single night, not occasionally, not just on special feast days, every night, year after year after year. For some monks, this continued for their entire adult lives, from their entry into the monastery as teenagers or young men until their death decades later. The physical toll was significant. The human body craves consolidated sleep, and being yanked from deep sleep in the middle of the night every night creates a state of chronic sleep deprivation. Historical records mention monks falling asleep during services, a problem serious enough that most monastic rules included punishments for it. If you were caught dozing during matins, you might be assigned extra manual labour, additional fasting, or required to perform extra prayers as penance. Some monks struggled more than others. Younger monks still adjusting to monastic life found the schedule brutal. Older monks, their bodies worn down by years of inadequate sleep, might find it increasingly difficult to stay alert during the long midnight service. The monastic chroniclers occasionally noted brothers who nodded off standing in the choir stalls, only to be shaken awake by the monk next to them or by the abbot himself. But the schedule didn't end with matins. After the service concluded, somewhere around 3:30 or 4 in the morning, the monks would return to the dormitory. Now came a choice, and different orders handled it differently. Some orders, particularly stricter ones like the Cistercians, didn't allow monks to return to bed after matins. Instead, they went directly to private prayer, study, or manual labour, treating matins as the end of their sleeping period. Other orders, recognising the human need for sleep, allowed monks to return to bed for a second sleep after matins. They would sleep until lauds at dawn, catching perhaps another 2 or 3 hours of rest. This aligned, probably not coincidentally, with the broader pattern of segmented sleep that was common in medieval society. The monks were simply being woken during what would otherwise be their natural waking period between first and second sleep. Still, this wasn't exactly the same as the segmented sleep practiced by lay people. For ordinary people, the waking period between first and second sleep was optional and flexible. You could lie in bed and pray quietly, or get up and do chores, or engage in intimacy with your spouse, or simply enjoy the peace and quiet. For monks, the waking period was mandatory, structured, communal, and entirely devoted to worship. There was no flexibility, no personal choice about how to spend that time. Different monastic orders had slightly different schedules. The Benedictines, following the rule of St. Benedict written in the 6th century, maintained the full canonical hours as described above. The Cistercians, a reformed Benedictine order that arose in the late 11th century, kept a similar schedule but emphasised manual labour during the day. The Carthusians, hermit monks who lived in individual cells, still gathered for nighttime prayers but spent more time in solitary devotion. In convents, nuns followed similar schedules. They rose for nighttime prayers, chanted the hours, and lived according to the same demanding rhythm. If anything, the pressure on nuns might have been greater, as they were constantly fighting against medieval assumptions about women's weakness and inability to maintain the same standards of discipline as men. The justification for this brutal schedule was theological and spiritual. Night was considered a particularly appropriate time for prayer because it required sacrifice. It would be easy to pray during comfortable daylight hours when you're already awake. It cost you nothing. But dragging yourself from sleep in the cold darkness to worship God, that was true devotion. That was proof of your commitment. There was also biblical precedent. Psalm 119 includes the line, "At midnight I rise to give you thanks," which was interpreted as a command to offer nocturnal worship. Jesus himself was described as praying through the night in the Garden of Gethsemane. The early Christian communities included nighttime vigils as part of their worship practice. Medieval monks saw themselves as continuing this ancient tradition, maintaining a continuous cycle of prayer that sanctified every hour of the day and night. Some monastic writers suggested that nighttime prayer had special power, that prayers offered in darkness and difficulty rose more directly to God than prayers offered in ease and comfort. The night was when demons were most active, so filling it with prayer and psalm singing pushed back against the forces of evil, creating a shield of holiness that protected not just the monastery but the wider Christian community. For all its difficulty, many monks found deep meaning in the practice. The discipline itself became a form of meditation, a way of transcending the body's demands and entering a state of spiritual focus. The repetition of psalms in the quiet darkness could be hypnotic, transporting the mind beyond the discomfort of cold and fatigue into something approaching mystical experience. And perhaps there was something powerful about being awake when the rest of the world slept, standing in a dimly lit church with your brothers, singing ancient words of praise while outside the walls everything lay in darkness. It set monks apart, marked them as different, as dedicated to something beyond the ordinary concerns of life. They were keeping watch, maintaining a spiritual vigil, serving as God's sentries through the dangerous hours of night. But make no mistake, it was also exhausting, physically punishing, and for some monks, probably miserable. Not everyone who entered monastic life discovered deep spiritual meaning in being awakened at 2 a.m. every single night. Some presumably endured rather than embraced the practice, counting it as one more sacrifice demanded by their vows. The monastic schedule wasn't designed for comfort or natural human rhythms. It was designed to break down the self, to remake the person through discipline and deprivation into something more spiritually refined. Whether it succeeded in this goal likely varied from person to person, but there's no question it created some of the most sleep-deprived people in medieval society. Darkness in the medieval world wasn't just the absence of light, it was a presence, an entity, a realm where different rules applied and different dangers lurked. To understand medieval bedtime routines, we must understand medieval fears about the night itself. And those fears ran deep, shaped by folklore, religion, experience and imagination. In a world without electric lights, without street lamps, without even reliable candles for most people, darkness was absolute. On a cloudy night with no moon, you literally couldn't see your hand in front of your face. This wasn't the mild dimness of a modern bedroom with streetlight filtering through curtains. This was complete, total, overwhelming blackness. That darkness was filled with sounds. Owls screeching, foxes calling out, wolves howling in the distance, the wind rattling shutters, trees creaking, and every sound, when you couldn't see its source, became potentially threatening. Was that footsteps outside the door? Was something moving in the corner of the room? The imagination, deprived of visual input, works overtime, and medieval imaginations had plenty of material to work with. Medieval people believed, genuinely and deeply, that a night was when evil forces were most active. Demons, witches, malevolent spirits, and all manner of supernatural creatures were thought to emerge after dark, moving through the world while good Christians slept. This wasn't just superstition or folklore. It was supported by church teaching and theological authority. Demons were considered real, active, and dangerous. They sought to corrupt human souls, and darkness provided them with cover and opportunity. A demon might approach your bed while you slept, whispering temptations, planting evil thoughts, or even attempting possession. The boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was believed to be thinner at night, making such encounters more likely. Ghosts and restless spirits were also thought to walk at night. The souls of the dead who hadn't received proper burial, who had died with unfinished business, or who were trapped in purgatory might appear to the living. Some of these apparitions were harmless or even helpful, seeking prayers or masses for their release from purgatory. Others were malevolent, seeking to drag the living into death with them. Witches, according to medieval belief, conducted their evil works at night. They flew on broomsticks or transformed into animals. They gathered for Sabbaths, where they worshipped the devil and plotted harm against Christians. A person going to sleep never knew if some witch from the village might be casting a curse on them at that very moment, causing illness or misfortune. Fairies and other folk spirits occupied an ambiguous space in medieval belief, somewhere between Christian demonology and older pagan traditions. These beings were often associated with nighttime, and encounters with them could be dangerous. They might steal babies and replace them with changelings. They might lead travellers astray. They might curse those who offended them. Protection from fairies required specific rituals and precautions, many of them pre-Christian in origin, but adapted to medieval Christian contexts. Werewolves and vampires, though their medieval forms differed from modern popular culture versions, were also night creatures. Stories circulated of people who transformed into wolves under the full moon, prowling for victims. The undead who rose from graves to drain blood or life force from the living were subjects of folk tales across Europe. Whether people genuinely believed these stories or simply enjoyed being frightened by them probably varied from person to person, but the tales contributed to an atmosphere where darkness itself felt dangerous. Real dangers also lurked in the night. Thieves and bandits operated under cover of darkness, breaking into homes or waylaying travellers. Fire was an ever-present threat, and nighttime fires were particularly deadly because they could spread unnoticed until it was too late to escape. Wild animals, wolves especially, were genuine threats in many areas. A wolf pack might approach a village at night, drawn by the smell of livestock or desperation from hunger. Given all these fears, both supernatural and mundane, medieval people developed numerous protective practices for nighttime. We've already discussed bedtime prayers as the primary spiritual defense, but there were other rituals and precautions as well. Making the sign of the cross was a simple but powerful protective gesture. People would cross themselves before getting into bed, blessing their sleeping space and their own bodies against evil influence. Some made crosses on their doors or windows, either with their fingers or by placing actual blessed crosses or crucifixes in strategic locations. Holy water was another common protection. Those who had access to it might sprinkle a bit around their sleeping area, or make the sign of the cross with it on their foreheads before lying down. Blessed objects like rosaries, small relics of saints, or devotional images were kept near the bed, sometimes under the pillow or hanging on the wall nearby. Certain herbs were believed to repel evil spirits and promote peaceful sleep. Placing sprigs of rue, verveine, St. John's wort or other protective plants under the pillow, in the mattress, or hung above the bed was a widespread folk practice. These herbs often had dual purposes, believed to protect against both spiritual dangers and physical pests like fleas and bedbugs. Salt, that most basic of substances, had protective properties in medieval folk belief. A line of salt across the threshold or a small amount of salt under the pillow could prevent evil entities from approaching. This practice, like many others, blended pre-Christian folk magic with Christian spirituality in ways the church didn't entirely approve of but couldn't quite stamp out. Some people recited specific protective verses before sleep, passages from the Psalms being particularly popular. Psalm 91, which speaks of protection under God's wings and deliverance from the terror of night and the pestilence that stalks in darkness, was especially favoured. These verses weren't just comforting words, they were believed to have actual spiritual power to shield the reciter from harm. For children, who were thought to be especially vulnerable to fairy abduction and spiritual attack, Parents might place an iron object near the crib or bed. Iron was believed to repel fairies and other supernatural beings. A simple nail, a pair of scissors, or a knife under the baby's mattress could keep malevolent spirits at bay. Leaving a light burning through the night was desirable if you could afford it, though few could. Candles and oil were expensive. Most people had to make do with darkness. But for those who could manage it, a small candle or oil lamp burning through the night provided both practical illumination and symbolic protection. Light drove away evil, both metaphorically and, people hoped, literally. Some homes had specific threshold protections, blessings, or physical barriers meant to prevent unwanted entry by either human or supernatural visitors. A horseshoe hung over the door was common. Certain prayers or Bible verses might be written on the doorframe or carved into the wood. The threshold itself was considered a liminal space, a boundary between the safe interior and the dangerous outside world, and therefore required special protection. Despite all these precautions, nighttime remained frightening for many medieval people. The darkness was too complete, the silence too full of strange sounds, the vulnerability of sleep too real. Parents comforted frightened children with prayers and stories. Spouses lay close together for both warmth and reassurance. And everyone hoped that morning would come quickly, bringing with it the light that would chase away the fears and dangers of the night. Let's shift from the spiritual and supernatural to the aggressively practical. Because beyond fears of demons and dreams, medieval people faced very concrete challenges when it came to nighttime comfort and hygiene. And two objects more than any others defined the practical reality of medieval nights: the chamber pot and the bed warmer. We'll start with the chamber pot, that essential but unglamorous fixture of medieval bedrooms. A chamber pot is a portable toilet meant for nocturnal use in the bedroom, common in many cultures before the advent of indoor plumbing and flushing toilets. The reason for chamber pots was simple. In towns or at night, people used chamber pots, unglazed ceramic bowls kept under beds. Going outside to the privy or outhouse in the middle of the night was difficult, dangerous, and deeply unpleasant. Medieval homes had no electric lights. If you needed to urinate or defecate during the night, you had a few options, none of them appealing. You could try to make it outside in complete darkness, risking tripping, falling, encountering wild animals, or simply freezing. You could light a candle or lantern and venture out, but that took time and effort, and if the wind blew out your light, you'd be stranded in darkness anyway. Or you could use the chamber pot conveniently stored under your bed or in a nearby corner. Most people chose the chamber pot. These vessels came in various forms depending on wealth and status, typically earthenware or stoneware with wide rims and handles for stability. Chamber pots were manufactured in forms adaptable to both common homes and noble residences. The poorest families might have a simple, crude ceramic pot, unglazed and rough. Wealthier households had better-made pots, sometimes with handles for easier carrying, sometimes with lids to contain odours. The nobility could afford chamber pots made of more precious materials. Some were fashioned from pewter or even silver. Decorated chamber pots with painted designs or family crests were status symbols, proving that even the most basic bodily functions were opportunities to display wealth and refinement. Nobility and Renaissance castles frequently employed chamber pots with enclosed stools, padded chairs concealing the vessel for bedside use. These close stools were essentially chairs with holes in the seat, under which the chamber pot was positioned. They provided a bit more comfort and dignity than squatting over a pot on the floor. Using the chamber pot wasn't complicated. The act was simple. Squat, use cover. You pulled the pot out from under the bed or from its storage location, positioned yourself over it, did your business, and then returned it to its place, hopefully with a lid or cloth covering it to contain the smell. But the pot couldn't just sit there indefinitely. Someone had to empty it. In the morning, someone, often a servant or the youngest child, was tasked with emptying it. In wealthy households, this was a servant's job, often a chambermaid or the lowest-ranking household worker. In peasant families, it typically fell to children or women. Nobody wanted the job, but it had to be done. The emptying process varied by location. In rural areas, the contents might be dumped into a cesspit, a large hole in the ground where human waste accumulated. Chamber pots were used at night and then emptied into the cesspit. Eventually, these cesspits would be cleaned out, often by professional workers who came at night, and the waste might be used as fertilizer for fields. In urban areas, disposal was more problematic. In some cases, the contents of the chamber pots would simply be thrown out from the window into the streets, done for instance by the tenants of high-rise buildings in medieval Edinburgh. This practice, as disgusting as it sounds, was common enough that warning cries became customary. People would shout "Gardez-l'eau," supposedly derived from the French "Gardez-l'eau," meaning watch out for the water, before dumping their chamber pot contents into the street below. Pedestrians learned to stay alert and walk carefully, especially at certain times of day. The streets of medieval cities, especially before sanitation reforms, were absolutely foul as a result. Human waste mixed with animal waste, garbage and mud created a toxic stew that filled gutters and pooled in low spots. The streets of medieval London, for instance, became so full of filth, which included the excrement of both animals and humans, that muckrakers were hired to clean the streets. These workers, paid relatively well for their awful job, would shovel the accumulated filth and cart it away, usually to dump it outside the city walls. Chamber pot hygiene varied widely. Wealthy households might have servants clean and rinse the pots regularly. Poor families washed them when they could, but with limited water and no understanding of bacterial contamination, clean was relative. The pots might be rinsed with water, perhaps scrubbed with sand or ash to remove residue, and then dried and returned to use. Now let's turn to a more pleasant practical necessity: staying warm through long, cold nights. Medieval winters were brutal, especially during the Little Ice Age that occurred during much of the medieval period, when temperatures across Europe dropped significantly. Homes were drafty, heating was limited, and hypothermia was a real danger. Bed warmers were one solution, though they were luxuries available primarily to the wealthy. The most common type was a long-handled pan made of brass or copper, sometimes called a warming pan. Hot coals from the fire would be placed in this pan, and it would be carefully run between the sheets and across the mattress before bedtime, warming the bed. The pan had to be moved constantly to avoid scorching the linens or starting a fire. And once the bed was warmed, the pan was removed. This provided temporary warmth, enough to make climbing into bed less shocking, but the heat dissipated relatively quickly. Still, it was better than nothing. Servants in wealthy households would warm their masters' beds as part of the evening routine, making the transition to sleep more comfortable. For those who couldn't afford fancy warming pans, heated stones or bricks served the same purpose. A large stone or brick would be placed in or near the fire until it was hot, then wrapped in cloth to prevent burns and placed at the foot of the bed. These retained heat longer than a warming pan, but were harder to maneuver and had to be positioned carefully to avoid unwanted burns during the night. Hot water bottles in a primitive form also existed. A sturdy pottery or the metal container could be filled with boiling water, sealed tightly and placed in the bed. This provided heat for several hours and was safer than hot coals or stones, though the containers sometimes leaked or cracked, creating unpleasant surprises. For most people, though, the primary sources of nighttime warmth were blankets, body heat, and proximity to others. Heavy wool blankets, furs if you could afford them, and simply piling on every available bit of fabric was standard practice. Multiple people sleeping together in the same bed wasn't just about space efficiency, it was about survival. 2 or 3 bodies generated significantly more heat than one, making shared beds a practical necessity in winter. The combination of inadequate heating, heavy blankets, and multiple bed partners created an environment that was often stuffy, smelly, and uncomfortable despite being cold. But discomfort was preferable to freezing, so people endured. You might wake up with someone's elbow in your ribs and the smell of unwashed bodies filling your nostrils, but at least you'd wake up alive and not frozen solid. Medieval sleep wasn't just interrupted by natural wake periods between first and second sleep, it was constantly disrupted by the rhythms and demands of medieval life itself. The modern expectation of quiet, uninterrupted sleep in a controlled environment would have seemed absurd to medieval people. Sleep was something you fit in between the demands of work, worship, and survival, and it was almost never peaceful. The most constant source of sleep disruption was the ringing of church bells. In every town, village, and city across medieval Europe, church bells marked the passage of time and the rhythm of the day. They rang for morning prayers, midday prayers, evening prayers, and of course nighttime prayers. They rang for masses, for deaths, for births, for festivals, and for warnings of danger. If you lived anywhere near a church or monastery, and most people did, you were subjected to this constant acoustic bombardment. The bells for matins at 2 or 3 in the morning were particularly jarring, designed specifically to wake both the monks who needed to pray and the faithful who were encouraged to offer prayers from their beds even if they didn't physically attend the service. You couldn't complain about the bells. Complaining would suggest you objected to worship and devotion, which could bring suspicion on your spiritual state. So people simply accepted the noise as part of life. If a bell woke you in the middle of the night, you might say a quick prayer, roll over, and try to return to sleep. Or you might take it as a signal to use the chamber pot, check the fire, or complete some small task before settling back down for your second sleep. During times of crisis, bells rang far more frequently and frantically. Warning bells for fire, for invasion, for any emergency would shatter the night, bringing people stumbling from their beds in terror and confusion. In these moments, sleep was abandoned entirely as everyone responded to the threat. The seasons dramatically affected sleep patterns. In summer, with long daylight hours, people went to bed later and rose earlier. There was simply more time when work could be done by natural light, so sleep was compressed. In winter, when darkness dominated and there was less work possible, people slept more. The natural rhythm of segmented sleep fit well with these seasonal variations, allowing people to adjust their sleeping and waking hours based on the amount of available light. Weather was another major factor. Storms could be terrifying, with thunder, lightning and howling winds creating conditions that made rest difficult if not impossible. Rain might leak through thatched roofs, dripping onto sleeping people below. Snow could pile up against walls and doors, the cold seeping through every crack. Extreme weather meant sleepless nights spent trying to stay warm, dry and safe. Illness and disease, ever present in medieval life, disrupted sleep on both individual and community levels. A sick child coughing through the night kept the whole family awake. An elderly person in pain might moan or cry out. And during epidemic diseases like plague, the death carts rolling through streets in the early morning, collecting bodies from the night's death toll, provided a grim wake-up call no one wanted, but everyone expected during outbreaks. War and violence brought their own disruptions. During times of conflict, fear of nighttime raids or attacks kept people sleeping lightly, ready to wake at the slightest sound. Soldiers on campaign slept even more fitfully, often in armour or with weapons at hand, always alert for enemy movements. The trauma of violence could create lasting sleep problems, with survivors of raids or battles suffering nightmares and insomnia. Animal noises were constant. Dogs barked at real or imagined threats. Roosters began crowing well before dawn, often in the middle of the night if something disturbed them. Cats fought. Livestock made their various sounds. Rodents scurried through walls and rafters. The medieval soundscape was never truly silent, even in the depths of night. Human activities also created noise. In cities, night watchmen patrolled streets, calling out the hours and announcing that all was well, or raising alarms when it wasn't. Taverns might stay open late, with drunken patrons singing, arguing or fighting. Criminals operated under cover of darkness, and the sounds of break-ins or street violence were not uncommon. In castle and manor households, guards walked their rounds all night, their footsteps and occasional conversations audible to those trying to sleep. Babies and young children, of course, didn't care about anyone's sleep schedule. They woke when hungry, wet, scared or sick, and their crying woke everyone else. In homes where multiple families lived in close quarters, or where a single room housed parents, children, grandparents, and possibly servants or apprentices, one person's sleep disruption became everyone's problem. Despite all these interruptions and challenges, medieval people became remarkably adaptable. They learned to sleep through many disturbances that would keep us awake. The sound of church bells became background noise, noticed only when absent. Moderate weather was no obstacle to rest. Sharing a bed with multiple people was normal, and you learned to sleep despite snoring, movement, and body heat. What they couldn't easily sleep through, they endured. Lost sleep was simply part of life, not something to be optimized or worried about. There were no sleep studies, no concern about sleep debt or circadian rhythms. You slept when you could, woke when you must, and got on with the demanding business of survival. If you were tired during the day, well, so was everyone else. Work still needed to be done, prayers still needed to be said, and life marched on regardless of how well you'd slept the night before. The medieval relationship with sleep was fundamentally different from ours. We treat sleep as a protected, optimized, carefully managed activity. We invest in expensive mattresses, blackout curtains, white noise machines, and sleep tracking apps. We worry about getting enough quality sleep and view poor sleep as a problem to be solved. Medieval people treated sleep as they treated most things, a necessity to be managed with the resources available, but not something that could or should be perfected. You slept when darkness made work impossible. You woke when bells rang or necessity called. You endured discomfort, disturbances, and less than ideal conditions, because that was simply how life worked. Sleep wasn't supposed to be comfortable or restful by our standards, it was supposed to be survivable, and most nights it was. As we come to the end of our journey through medieval bedtime routines and sleep schedules, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on just how different the medieval approach to sleep was from our own, and what we might learn from that difference. Medieval sleep was communal, where ours is private. They shared beds with family members, guests, even strangers at inns. Their sleeping spaces were open, visible, and socially integrated. We prize private bedrooms, individual beds, and personal space. We see sharing a bed as intimacy, not necessity. Their sleep was segmented and flexible, where ours strives to be consolidated and optimized. They expected to wake in the middle of the night and saw this as natural. We view middle-of-the-night waking as insomnia, a problem requiring intervention. They used their watch period for prayer, work, or intimacy. We reach for our phones and doom scroll, then worry about why we can't fall back asleep. Medieval sleep was spiritually fraught, where ours is secular. They approached bedtime with prayers, protective rituals, and genuine fear about both physical and spiritual dangers. Every night was a journey into potentially dangerous territory requiring divine protection. We approach bedtime with maybe some Netflix and a melatonin gummy, viewing sleep as a biological process, not a spiritual passage. Their sleep environment was uncomfortable, cold, pest-infested, and shared with animals. Ours are climate-controlled, hypoallergenic, and carefully optimized for comfort. They slept on straw or, if lucky, feathers surrounded by bugs and mice. We sleep on memory foam and an advanced mattress technology in sanitized spaces. Medieval people accepted discomfort as inevitable. We view it as a problem to be solved through technology and consumer goods. They endured cold, noise disruption, and fear as part of life. We buy noise-cancelling curtains, heating systems, security systems, and anything else that promises a better night's rest. And yet, despite all their hardships and our advantages, one has to wonder who actually rested more peacefully. Medieval people, exhausted from physical labour and accepting of their limitations, might have fallen asleep quickly despite discomfort. We, with every physical comfort available, often lie awake worrying about whether we're sleeping correctly, whether we'll get enough hours, whether our sleep quality is sufficient. They viewed sleep as time stolen from waking life, hours when one was vulnerable and unproductive. We've come full circle to a similar view, trying to minimise sleep to maximise productivity, while simultaneously worrying that we're not getting enough. The medieval person who accepted segmented sleep and simply used the watch period for quiet reflection might have been on something we've lost. There are lessons in the medieval approach that might benefit our modern anxieties about sleep. The acceptance that sleep doesn't have to be perfect, the understanding that waking in the night doesn't mean something is wrong, the practice of using quiet nighttime hours for reflection, prayer, or gentle activity, rather than treating them as a failure of sleep hygiene. The recognition that sleep is resilient and humans can function on less than optimal rest if necessary. That's not to say we should return to sleeping on straw-filled sacks surrounded by fleas, sharing beds with strangers and livestock. The genuine improvements in sleep comfort, hygiene and safety that modernity has brought are not to be dismissed. Indoor plumbing means we don't need chamber pots. Central heating means we don't risk hypothermia. Modern medicine means we're less likely to die in our sleep from undiagnosed illness. These are good things, but perhaps we can adopt a bit of the medieval pragmatism about sleep. Accept that it won't always be perfect. Understand that our bodies might naturally want to wake for a while in the middle of the night, and that's okay. Use the quiet hours for gentle activity rather than anxious phone checking. Pray if we're so inclined, reflect, read, or simply lie peacefully rather than forcing consolidated sleep that our bodies might not naturally want. Medieval people survived and thrived, despite sleep conditions we would find intolerable. They rose for midnight prayers, worked long hours after fragmented rest, and built cathedrals and launched crusades and created art despite chronic sleep deprivation by modern standards. They weren't superhuman, they simply had different expectations and different relationships with rest. Tonight, when you climb into your comfortable bed with its clean sheets and modern mattress, when you adjust your thermostat and set your alarm, maybe take a moment to appreciate the distance we've travelled from medieval sleeping conditions. But also consider that when you wake at 2 in the morning and can't immediately fall back asleep, you're not broken. you might just be experiencing a bit of your first sleep ending, signalling the start of what your medieval ancestors would have called the watch. And that's not a problem. It's just your body remembering a rhythm humans followed for thousands of years. Tonight, when you climb into your comfortable bed with its clean sheets and modern mattress, when you adjust your thermostat and set your alarm, maybe take a moment to appreciate the distance we've travelled from medieval sleeping conditions. But also consider that when you wake at 2 in the morning and can't immediately fall back asleep, you're not broken. You might just be experiencing a bit of your first sleep ending, signalling the start of what your medieval ancestors would have called the watch. And that's not a problem. It's just your body remembering a rhythm humans followed for thousands of years. Sleep tight, and may your dreams be free of demons, fleas, and the sound of chamber pots being emptied at dawn. And with that, we've reached the end of tonight's journey through the medieval world of sleep. I hope you found this exploration as fascinating as I did putting it together. The way our ancestors approached something as fundamental as sleep really does give us a window into how differently they experienced the world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval bedtime routines, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you might think, and it lets me know that these long-form historical explorations are something you want to see more of. And if there's a particular aspect of medieval life or any other historical period that you'd like me to cover in a future video, drop a comment below. I read all of them, and your suggestions often become the next topic I research. Thank you for spending this time with me, wandering through the cold stone corridors of medieval nights, investigating straw-filled mattresses, and discovering that our ancestors were probably a lot more sleep-deprived than we realise. Whether you're listening to this to fall asleep yourself or just out of curiosity about how people lived centuries ago, I'm grateful you chose to be here. Until next time, rest well, sleep deeply, and remember that however you sleep tonight, Stieti, you're doing better than someone sharing a bed with 3 family members, 2 dogs and a chicken that won't stop clucking. Good night.